Yeah. All right, you gonna be listening? I think I'm live. Okay. Love you too. No. All right. I think it is time. Glad to see everybody tonight. Hope everybody is doing well and having a good week. We are continuing our look at the Holy Lands. And I will tell you that I always put my slides together kind of between the two Wednesdays. And then I come back on the Wednesday, like today, and review them before I present them. Because I've already sent them to the church to have them loaded. And I was like, I did not do a great job with the slides tonight. So I'll have to fill in some gaps that I left with, especially as it relates to maps. I'll do my best to fill in some gaps there. But for those of you that have either been with us or not been with us, we've been kind of making our way clockwise around the nation of Israel. We started off on the Mediterranean, looking at Caesarea Maritima, and from there we've gone through the Jezreel Valley, gone up into the Galilean Panhandle, looking at places like Dan and Caesarea Philippi. Last week we went down into the region immediately surrounding the Sea of Galilee. We looked at Capernaum, we looked at Magdala, and tonight we're going to talk about the sea itself. Along with the Jordan River, talk a little bit about the Jordan River, and then close out by talking about two biblical sites for which there have been no biblical excavations. So by that I mean two sites that are a part of Scripture, but that nothing has been excavated from those sites that pertain to events in Scripture. But I want to just briefly go over them, and then the night will be yours. So we're going to start off talking about. Oh, I almost skipped this. If you do want a copy of the slides along with my notes, especially for the ones that are just pictures, I usually have some notes underneath them explaining what you're seeing in the pictures. You can go to that web address and download copies of any of the slides that are that are a part of this slide deck. All right, so we're going to start off talking about the Sea of Galilee. Now, whenever I have kind of a header slide like this, I try to put all of the scripture references on it. That I couldn't have fit all the scripture references for the Sea of Galilee on a slide, and so. These are scripture references related to two events that took place on the Sea of Galilee. But the Sea of Galilee is mentioned way more than just these four references, okay? The Sea of Galilee is a location that is mentioned in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, and is mentioned many, many, many times in the Gospels, especially as it relates to the ministry of Jesus, because as we talked about last week, we looked at Capernaum, we looked at Magdala, we looked at the traditional site of the Sermon on the Mount, that Jesus, spent a significant portion of his ministry around the Sea of Galilee. And so the Sea of Galilee features very prominently in the ministry of Jesus. I've got a couple of different maps to show you, and I wish I had started out with one that was a little further out and then kind of zeroed in. Because on the way over here, one of my daughters said, hey, can you talk about where the Sea of Galilee is in relation to the Mediterranean Sea? And I said, yeah, that would have been a great map to have. I've got a map later that when we talk about the Jordan River, we can kind of put all the pieces together. But I want to start off kind of zeroed in on the Sea of Galilee. So last week, we talked about Capernaum. So there's Capernaum, and this is kind of a tourist map, if you can't tell. It's got all the sites on it. But this is Capernaum up here in what they usually describe as the northwest. I would just call that the north. But there's Capernaum. We talked about Magdala last week. There is Magdala on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. Over here, you've got the plain of Bethsaida. You've got the city of or the town of Bethsaida up here to the northeast. The plain of Bethsaida, which is where Jesus fed the 5,000. And so this is the sea. Now the sea, we'll see this on some slides in just a minute, but for those of you that have been there, is this a sea? No, this is a lake, okay? This is a lake. This is a lake that is 13 miles from north to south and 7 miles wide at its widest point. If you're up in a hotel room, you can easily see across the entire thing with even on a foggy day, you can see from one side to the other. And so this is a lake. It's quite simply a lake. If you're in the middle of it, which we'll see some pictures in just a minute, for those of you that spend any time on the water here, you feel like you're on one of the lakes here. I mean, it just doesn't feel that much different. It's just a lake, okay? But again, all of these, this area, especially in the northern part of Galilee, this was the area of the ministry of Jesus during his Galilean ministry. Another map just to show you, this has kind of got some of the kind of elevation showing you around the side, but again, the same kind of things are labeled. This does have the plain of Gennesaret that is between Capernaum and Magdala, which we'll talk about that in just a minute. In various places, it's actually referred to as the Sea of Gennesaret or the Lake of Gennesaret. But again, just a different view. We'll talk about in just a minute that the Sea of Galilee is very far below sea level. We think of the Dead Sea being below sea level. The Sea of Galilee is below sea level, not nearly as far as the Dead Sea, but it is below sea level and is surrounded by hills or mountains, around most of the sea. So a few things, just some statistics. So at its deepest point, it's around 150 feet deep. As I mentioned before, 13 miles from north to south, 7 miles east to west at its widest point. If you just went out and searched the internet for Sea of Galilee statistics, most of them are going to quote that it's 686 feet below sea level. That is the stated number, but actually the surface of the lake has been quite a bit lower than that for the last several years, primarily because the water, the fresh water from the Sea of Galilee is used to provide 40% of the fresh water in the area surrounding the Sea of Galilee. And because of other factors in addition to that, the sea is losing what's the word I'm looking for here? It is losing depth. It is just like the Dead Sea is, which we'll talk about later in another class. But because it is being used more than it is being replenished, and so it is below its generally stated elevation of 686 feet below sea level. Now, I know, thinking about in terms of the bodies of water in Israel, before I had been there, I never really thought of the Jordan River being anywhere but between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. But having been there now, I know that the Jordan River begins well north of the Sea of Galilee, actually in the foot of Mount Hermon. Now, if you remember back when we talked about the city of Dan, I showed you a picture of the Dan Springs or the Dan River, which is one of 4 tributaries that feed the Jordan River. So the Jordan River begins all the way up in the foothills of Mount Hermon and comes down and feeds into the Sea of Galilee. before it then exits the Sea of Galilee and goes on all the way down to the Dead Sea. So one of the primary sources of water for the Sea of Galilee is the Jordan River coming in from the north. That is not the only source, but one of the primary sources of water that goes into the Sea of Galilee. I just mentioned that there are 4 tributaries, the largest of which, actually I don't have that on there. That's on the talk about the Jordan River in a minute. There's 4 names that this sea is known by in Scripture, okay? Far fewer mentions of the Sea of Galilee in the Old Testament, though it is mentioned in the Old Testament. In Numbers and Joshua, when you read about the Sea of Chinnereth, that is referring to the same location that we know of as the Sea of Galilee today. But you will also see the names in the New Testament, the Sea of Gennesaret and the Sea of Tiberias. Now, I'm going to go back to one of these maps. Those are named after the plain of Gennesaret that is, between Capernaum and Magdala, or the city of Tiberias, which is kind of on the southwestern part of the Sea of Galilee. And so in various places in Scripture, you will see the Sea of Gennesaret or the Sea of Tiberias referring to the same place. And then most commonly, either the Sea of Galilee or the Lake of Galilee in Scripture. 53 times you will find a reference to this body of water in the Gospels. 48 of those times you'll see it referred to as either sea or Sea of Galilee, and 5 times you'll see it referred to as a lake. As I mentioned, in today's terms, this is a lake. This is not an ocean. This is not a sea. It is a lake. Now, there are lots of significant events that took place in and around the Sea of Galilee, but 2 obvious ones that took place, without going through just an exhaustive list of every single thing that happened. 2 of the things are the calming of the Sea of Galilee, with Jesus calming it when he was in the boat with his disciples, those men that were going to be his apostles, and then Jesus walking on the water. Those are the 2 things that, to me anyway, that if you say, hey, what are the significant events that took place on the sea, those are the 2 that jump out to me. We talked about last week in discussing Capernaum, the miraculous catch of fish that would have taken place just off the shore at the northern part near Capernaum. But these are 2, besides that event, these are the 2 that really stand out to me as events that took place on the Sea of Galilee in Scripture. And one thing about, I'll mention this before we look at the pictures, but, when you go to Israel, and I make fun of this a little bit by talking about traditional sites and how do we know it's a traditional site because there's a church building there, right? There's nothing traditional about the Sea of Galilee. There's no controversy as to whether, is this the Sea of Galilee or is this something else? And it's pretty humbling to be on the sea and just to think, this is where Jesus walked. This is where Jesus told Peter to get out of the boat, and Peter stepped out of the boat and walked on that water. This is the place where Jesus calmed the storm when the disciples were in the boat on the Sea of Galilee. I mean, that's pretty humbling to think about that because, again, there's no controversy as to whether that's the real site or not. You know that you're on the Sea of Galilee when you're on the Sea of Galilee. Incidentally, I was told, I shared this with Bruce and a few others last week, but for those of you that knew Dr. Conley, who went to the Holy Lands, Bruce helped me, 25, 27 times, something like that. When I was on my trip last year, our group was led by Dr. Rodney Cloud, who at one time was a colleague of Dr. Conley's at Lipscomb. And the 2 made a few trips together. But he shared a story with me about a time when they were on the Sea of Galilee in the winter, when it was the rainy season, in one of Dr. Conley's last trips, and that he had told Dr. Cloud, I'm disappointed that I've never been here during a storm. And I as many times as I've been, I've never been during a storm. And said that on that time, when they were out on the Sea of Galilee, it started storming. And said the boat started rocking, and said everybody else was looking terrified are we going to get back to the shore before, something happens? And he said, I looked over, and Dr. Conley had a giddy grin on his face. He was so excited that it was storming on the Sea of Galilee. And I could just see that. I could see that in my mind. And it just, brought a smile to my face when I heard that story. And I thought some of you would appreciate that. But anyway, when I think of the Sea of Galilee, I think of those two events kind of above any others. Now, this is a view at sunrise over the Sea of Galilee from my hotel room in Tiberias. I got to wake up to this, I think, 4 mornings in a row. So it was a beautiful, beautiful view to have, every morning looking out over the Sea of Galilee. But just a beautiful area, very, very lush, very green, very beautiful. A lake surrounded by mountains. It's very beautiful. This is a picture taken from the boat dock on the kind of the northern part near Capernaum, the northern part of the Sea of Galilee. This is a picture that I believe, so this is actually on a boat in the Sea of Galilee. This one is taken toward the area that today is known of. This would be within the Golan Heights that you hear of today. Likely would have been the area of the Gadarenes. From Scripture, the story of Jesus healing the demon-possessed man. So that's likely the area. That would have been so let me go back to my map. See, I didn't do a good job with the maps tonight, so I'm going to go back and forth a bunch. But, that area of the Gadarenes would have been over on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. But to get back here, this is the opposite side, and it was a fairly, cloudy, foggy day. So this is not an awesome picture, but this is the eastern shore. This is the city of Tiberias today, which is a very large and sprawling city on the edge of the Sea of Galilee today. So this is on the eastern side. But again, when you see these pictures, what do you think? It just looks like a lake, right? I mean, because that's what it is. It's a lake. Just another picture to show, kind of the hills surrounding the Sea of Galilee. Another picture showing another boat that was on the sea, but on the lake. But again, nothing unique about any of that. I do want to show you just a very quick video. I think it's 2 minutes that I pieced together just to show you some live action shots of the lake. Rather than just all still photos, so you can kind of see what it looks like going around. I will give you a disclaimer. There are some personal pictures in this, so, take those for what they're worth. There's even a slight little clip of me, my dad took of me while they were playing the national anthem when we were getting on the boat, which is kind of cool, kind of corny, but anyway, take it for what it's worth.
Sinking deep in sin, far from the peaceful shore, very deeply stained within, sinking to rise no more. But the master of the sea heard my despairing cry. safe am I. Love lifted me, love lifted me, when nothing else could help, love lifted me.
All right. So thank you for indulging me with that. I thought maybe that would be helpful for those of you that have never been there to see a little bit of movement around on the Sea of Galilee. One last thing I want to talk about as it relates to the Sea of Galilee is something that they found actually on the bank of the Sea of Galilee back in 1986 during a time of drought when the water had receded even more than normal. There were two men who found two nails, ancient nails, sticking up out of the mud, and doing a little digging realized that, hey, we may have something here. And they discovered, ultimately figured out that this was a almost fully intact boat dated back to the 1st century, and it had been almost completely preserved because it had been in the mud for 2,000 years. And, you know, one of the things that really struck me was I previously have been to Norway, and I've been to Viking museums where they have these ships that have been preserved for like 800, 900, 1,000 years, and you think, wow, that's incredible. And then you've got this one that's 2,000 years that it's been preserved. But you know, the thing that's really neat as far as giving you some context is that, you know, what were the profession of most of the 12 disciples of Jesus? They were fishermen, right? So they were, you know, they were out on this lake every day fishing from a boat. And to be able to get some context and know, well, what kind of boat were they in? You know, we see pictures when we're in Sunday school, you know, or, you know, you've got the stories in the storybooks, but what did the boat actually look like? What did those boats actually look like? And this gives you a chance to see that. But they found this thing in 1986, and just to kind of fast forward the story, it took them 10 years to preserve it in such a way that they could put it on display. It involved them coating the entire thing in polyurethane foam and floating it on the Sea of Galilee to where they could lift it and take it to a facility where for 10 years they worked on with different fluids and materials on how they could preserve the wood and expose it to, you know, to the air in a museum to allow people to see it, because otherwise it was just going to disintegrate once it was taken out of the mud. And so it took them 10 years, but now it is on display so that you can see it. And this is what it looks like. And again, you know, no one would doubt that it's really old, but it's incredible how intact it is to be, you know, from the 1st century, you know, to be a 2,000-year-old fishing boat, and, you know, presumably one like that would have been used by the disciples of Jesus when they were fishing, when they were in their profession, when they were fishing. It's just incredible. They've got a model there that shows how they protected it when they got it out of the mud and they covered it in polyurethane foam and you floated it. And this is how they surrounded the entire thing in foam and actually floated the thing on the Sea of Galilee to get it to a loading dock, get it to the dock where they could lift it and load it onto, I believe, to a truck and take it to a facility, a lab where they could work on it. And then they worked on it for 10 years before they got it into that state, you know, treated with all kinds of chemicals, but to preserve it so that you can see it today. So this was, they actually had to run me out of this room. We had a group of 90 people in my group that went through this. I was the last one to leave, and they had to ask me to leave. I was just enamored with this because, again, it just takes. It's a small thing, but it just, you know, to know again, you know, what was Peter doing when Jesus called him? I mean, he was fishing, right? And to say this is the kind of boat that the disciples would have been in, you know, when they were fishing, and it just really brought it to life. So this was a really neat thing to see in Israel. Length and the width, that is a great question that I don't remember. If I were guessing, I would say it was like 12 to 15 feet long, would be my guess. Those of you that have also seen it, what do you think? Something like that? A little bit longer, maybe 18 to 20 feet, something like that. It's hard to remember. Yeah, you can see it with the men, so yeah. It's probably bigger than it looks like in the picture, but yeah, I was thinking in terms of like I grew up on ski boats. Probably isn't like an 18 to 20 foot ski boat lengthwise today. But yeah, not a massive like commercial fishing vessel. This was a small boat. So anyway, pretty cool. All right, let's talk about the Jordan River. Jordan River also very, very prominent in Scripture. In both the Old and the New Testament. Significant events related to the Jordan River in both the Old and the New Testament. I mean, I'm sure most of you could name significant events that took place, in the Jordan River, around the Jordan River in both the Old and New Testaments. We'll talk about a few of those. But wow, that map looks terrible on the screen. But we'll do our best. So this is, a much broader perspective map. And just to kind of set the context, so we were just talking about the Sea of Galilee, which is right here, tiny little Sea of Galilee here. Here's the Mediterranean on the western side, the left side of this map. You've got the Mediterranean. There is the Sea of Galilee. So we started off, just south of Mount Carmel. And we've been working our way through the Jezreel Valley and southern lower Galilee up into the Galilean Panhandle. You can see Dan on the map here. We talked about Dan. And then you've got Mount Hermon, which we talked about when we talked about Dan and Caesarea Philippi. And you've got the Jordan River that begins all the way up here at the base of Mount Hermon. And the Jordan River runs all the way down, and it first goes into Lake Hula, which is a much, much smaller lake than the Sea of Galilee, before continuing on down into the Sea of Galilee, which it feeds into at the north, and in the southern end of the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River exits and goes all the way down and to the Dead Sea. And by the time it's at the Dead Sea, it is no longer fresh water. It is the saltiest water on the planet. And so that is the Jordan River. Now, in just a minute, I'm going to be talking about two locations, and I forgot to put maps there, so I'm going to mention them now, okay? So I'm going to talk in just a minute about Beth Shean, also known as Beth Shan, actually known by many names. Those are two of the most prominent names. We'll talk about that in just a minute, which is still in the north, near the northern part of the Jordan River. I actually show you a picture of the Jordan Valley from the top of the Tell in Beth Shan. And then a little later, we'll talk about Jericho, which is much further south. It's 10 miles north of the Dead Sea, in the Judean wilderness, that area, a desert area. So Beth Shean is in a very green and lush area. Jericho in a desert area. We'll talk about those two, but that's the Jordan River. So a few things. Significant things about the Jordan River. So I've already mentioned the four tributaries. The most significant of those is the Dan River, or the Dan Springs, which supplies 1/3 of the water for the Jordan River. Starts at Mount Hermon, goes all the way down to the Dead Sea. The Jordan River is it's relatively skinny. It's a skinny river. And it's a winding river, kind of like, those of you that are familiar with the Caney Fork River that, snakes back and forth, under the interstate. It kind of snakes like that. It kind of snakes back and forth. And it's 223 miles in length, even though it only covers 124 miles. So, because it's so winding, it's a lot longer than the distance it covers. So it covers 124 miles from north to south, but it's actually 223 miles long. And just like I mentioned with the Sea of Galilee, kind of receding because it's being used so much for fresh water, the same thing is true with the Jordan River. The Jordan River is being used by both Israel and Jordan, the country of Jordan, for water, for irrigation, and because of that, it has diminished the flow of the Jordan River into the Dead Sea, which is having significant repercussions on the Dead Sea, to where they have had proposals is not crazy, but is extensive as running a canal all the way from the Red Sea, not the Dead Sea, but the Red Sea, all the way over to the Dead Sea to try to replenish the water in the Dead Sea. And because the flow of because the Sea of Galilee is down, the Jordan River flow has been diminished, so the Dead Sea is receding at an incredibly alarming rate, that they're concerned that it's going to at some point cease to exist. And so they've got all kinds of radical plans for how to replenish the water in the Dead Sea. But anyway, for a number of reasons. Now, as far as Scripture goes, just like I mentioned with the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River is, the references to the Jordan River are extensive in Scripture, especially in the Old Testament. 180 times this river is mentioned in the Old Testament. But let's just talk about some of the highlights. Oh, and by the way, 15 times in the New Testament. Let's talk about a few highlights. So the first time we're introduced to the Jordan River is in Genesis 13 when you've got Abraham and Lot. And Lot, it's mentioned when he looks out and says that this is like the garden of Yahweh and mentions the Jordan River. Obviously, for those of you that know the story of the children of Israel, you know about the children of Israel crossing the Jordan River, being led by the priests, led by Joshua, but led by the priests into the water, carrying the Ark of the Covenant, crossing the Jordan River, and that God parted the river to allow them to cross. I love that story because they had to go into the river before God parted it, which to me is the definition of faith. That they marched toward the water as though it was a definite that it was going to part. But it did not part until their feet stepped in the water. I love that. I love that part of the story. But that's that a very, very significant event. They crossed the Jordan River to go into the Promised Land. It's mentioned in the story of Elijah just prior to his ascension. He crossed the Jordan River. And then Elisha, it's very prominent in his, the things that he did in his ministry. Got the parting of the Jordan in 2 Kings 2. You've got the healing of Naaman, 2 Kings 5. The floating axe head, 2 Kings 6. All of those tie into the Jordan River. And then in the New Testament, if you were to ask me what's this most significant mention in the New Testament, it's John the Baptist, baptizing Jesus in the Jordan River. And so again, a body of water that is also very, very significant in terms of Scripture. Now, I'm not going to show a bunch of pictures of the Jordan River because as we kind of continue to move south, I'll have different views of the river as it kind of changes from, kind of the lush green landscape of Galilee to you move into kind of the desert area as you move further south. But this is the most non-commercialized picture I had from the northern part of the Jordan River. The very northern part of I shouldn't say the northern part. This is from just south of the Sea of Galilee, but the northern part of the river just south of the Sea of Galilee today is, those of you that have been, I'm sure you've been to one of the baptismal sites. It's very commercialized. It's a very commercialized area, but this is a picture just to kind of give you a sense of what the river looks like. Very, very green, lush in the northern part, but again, as you move further south, it becomes more. It's a river winding through the desert. As I mentioned, a very traditional baptismal area for folks to be baptized. But that's been turned into a commercial thing. I mean, you rent the baptismal robes and all that stuff. So, but anyway, lots of folks being baptized in the Jordan River. All right. In the last few minutes, I want to kind of breeze through a couple of places that I mentioned earlier and said, both of these are biblical places, but none of the excavations are related to anything that we read about in Scripture, okay? The first one of those is a site, Beth Shean, also known as Beth Shan, mentioned in Scripture a few times, before we talk about Scripture, let's talk about some of the details of the city. So this is in the kind of just south of the Sea of Galilee, very close to Mount Gilboa. It's at the area where the Jezreel Valley meets the Jordan Valley. We talked about the Jezreel Valley all the way back at the beginning of this class. And so it's right where the Jezreel Valley comes into the Jordan Valley. It's been occupied since the 5th century BC, so since is that right? That doesn't sound right. I'm going to go back and check that. That doesn't sound right to me. 5th century BC doesn't sound right there. But there is a large tell that is a part of this site, and where there are within the tell. So if you haven't been with us before, a tell is simply an artificial hill that has been made over time by civilization being built on top of civilization being built on top of civilization, and there is a tell there that has 20 layers of strata, 20 levels within it that has basically not been excavated. Okay? It is a tell that is largely untouched, save one structure up on top, which is identified as an Egyptian governor's house from much, much later than Bible times. And so that tell has largely been untouched, which is why when I say that this is a site that is mentioned in Scripture, but none of the excavations that have been made are, tied to Scripture, because the excavations are from the area surrounding the tell. So in, the Hellenistic period, after the time of Scripture, the city just exploded out from the tell and now covers a 400-acre, at the time covered a 400-acre area. And most of the excavations today are from the area around the tell, not from the tell itself. However, it is, again, relevant for Scripture in that the most significant story, and we'll cut to the chase here, is that when King Saul was killed in battle on Mount Gilboa, which, remember, Beth Shean is close to Mount Gilboa. When he was killed at Mount Gilboa, his body, the body of Saul, and those of his sons were taken and hung from the walls at Beth Shean. And his armor was placed in the temple of Ashtaroth, and his head was hung in the temple of Dagon. Okay, all of that took place at Beth Shean. Now, all of that would be in the tell. That is, again, largely not excavated today. It's just a hill. It's a hill. You can climb it. It's got a great view from the top of it, but there's really nothing that's been excavated there because the focus has been on the area surrounding the tell. Now, this is a view not of the entire site, but of a big portion of it, where you can see the tell in the background, and you can see the stairway that they have built to go to the top of it. But again, all of this is largely untouched. And so anything that would tie back to the biblical narrative, especially, anything related to the city as it would have been in the time of King Saul, would be in this tell. So everything surrounding the tell is largely from the Byzantine period. So 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th century AD, not BC, AD. And so, it's a very, very impressive site from an archaeological perspective because so many of these structures are way more intact than things that you would find from, the times of the Old Testament. For example, like at Megiddo or like Hazor. It's very, very impressive. There's a bathhouse from, somewhere between the 4th and 6th century, a bathhouse with a swimming pool, and there's the leftover remains of these mud pillars which held up a floor for the sauna, so that the water could run under the floor and the slaves would stand outside where the water was rushing in and burn fire to heat the water so that they could be in their sauna. And it had a cold room and a cool room and a sauna. So I mean, this was a sophisticated bathhouse. I did find it interesting, though, on the backside of this bathhouse, there is I believe this is from the 4th century. Now, I've shown you a couple of pictures already from biblical times of things that look like baptistries that were Jewish mikveh, that were, these were cleansing pools used for Jewish ritual cleansing. Well, this is a baptistry. This is a Byzantine baptistry. So again, most likely around 4th century, so 400 AD and beyond. But this area, over time was actually used as a Byzantine church building, this bathhouse. And so they built on the back side of it, they built a baptistry, a baptismal fountain as they call it. We would call it a baptistry today, on the back side of this bathhouse. Something else I wanted you to see, just because I've mentioned so much about with the tells, how within a tell you have different layers of strata for the different eras in which things were built. Well, because this site is so much newer than the time of Scripture and so much more intact, I mean, you can see these are from 2 different eras. And this is a road. This is a street that runs behind the bathhouse. And you can see, one type of material that the road was made out of, which this is actually mosaics that are still intact. And then you can see from like the next generation up on top of it that they've excavated, that's a different material from a different era. That's again, you can just clearly see the different levels of strata from the excavation. Now, running right down through the middle of the site is a street referred to as Palladius Street. One really neat thing besides the columns here is that this street, again, somewhere 4th to 6th century AD, so post-biblical time, but there's essentially a drainage pipe running down through the middle of the street. Very much ahead of their time, but very, very impressive. There's a Greek-style theater or amphitheater there, because it's later, so it's more intact than the one at Capernaum. It's a very beautiful theater. They actually still have concerts there today, because they've got all kinds of sound equipment in there, but a very, very impressive theater. They have, columns that they've excavated that they've kind of tried to leave them in the state in which they found them, because the city was destroyed in 749 AD by an earthquake. And so they have left some of the columns that were there the way they found them, because they would have been destroyed, knocked over by the earthquake. Now, this is getting closer to the tell, and again, this tell is made up of 20 layers. That's the estimate. It's made up of 20 layers. And this is the view from the top of the tell, but there's really nothing to show from the tell itself other than this, I think it's a 12th century AD Egyptian governor's house, which that's even way later than the rest of this. But one of the neat things up on top is the view of the Jordan Valley. Just beautiful. So this is looking toward the Jordan River, which is so skinny you can't really see it in this picture, but looking towards the Jordan River into the country of Jordan. So this is the Jordan Valley. This is kind of the area, again, just south of the Sea of Galilee, but just a beautiful, beautiful area, the kind of northern part of the Jordan Valley. All right, so that was Beth Shean. And final place I want to talk about, much further south, is the city of Jericho. Now, again, this is a city that is very, very prominent in the biblical narrative. But the excavations that have been completed to date have not uncovered anything that's specifically tied to the biblical narrative. I have my own theory on that, by the way, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But this is much further south. In terms of modern day, just a modern day note is that the city of Jericho is within the area that we know of today as the West Bank. And so this is just kind of an aside. When you go from, all of this is in Israel, but when you go from, Israeli-controlled area and you cross the border into the West Bank, into the Palestinian-controlled area, even if there was not a border there, I think you would know that something was different. Because this is not intended as any kind of political statement, but because there is no centralized government, there is no centralized, mechanism of providing services, basic services, that as soon as you cross into the West Bank, you notice that there's trash everywhere. There's lots of buildings that are just falling in on themselves. I mean, it's just a very, very different feel to the area than when you're in the Israeli-controlled areas, when you go into the West Bank. Jericho is very squarely in the West Bank, in the southern part of the West Bank, again, about 10 miles north of the Dead Sea. So, I mentioned that, 10 miles northwest of the Dead Sea. One of the reasons why a civilization built up in this area that is known as Jericho is because of a spring. And so Jericho is really considered to be like an oasis in the desert. So we've moved now from the lush greenery of the Jordan Valley of Galilee, and we're now squarely in the desert when you move down to Jericho. And there is a spring that is still there today that has been a source of fresh water for this area to where this is again like an oasis in the desert. And in Judges chapter 3 is referred to as the city of the palm trees, because there's water, there's water for palm trees to grow. We talked about Herod the Great a lot already. We'll keep talking about Herod the Great. Herod the Great built winter palaces in the ancient city of Jericho. Before we get to the book of Joshua, okay, which there's obviously a tie to Jericho in the book of Joshua. But before we get there, Jericho is primarily a geographical marker in Scripture, okay? And, not really talking about any specific events that happened, in or around Jericho, but used as a geographical marker. But obviously, as we move into Joshua, Jericho was where the walls tumbled down, right? I mean, that's what we know about that as. We know about, most of us have known about the city of Jericho and the story of what happened in Jericho since we were little in Sunday school. It's one of the first stories we learned, right? And so that's the significant story in the Old Testament. Move forward to the New Testament, and this is the location of Zacchaeus and his encounter with Jesus, among others. And so again, Jericho mentioned in both the Old and the New Testament. Now, I mentioned several times already that there are no excavations that have taken place in Jericho that directly tie to Scripture. There are, most of the excavations that I saw all were from way before the time of Joshua. And so because of some of the things that have been uncovered and the dating that has been done related to what has been uncovered, they claim that it's the oldest city in the world. Okay, that's their tourist slogan. Okay, tourism slogan. This is the Jericho travel department has issued that this is the oldest city in the world. Okay. Chamber of Commerce, that's the phrase I was looking for, that this is the oldest city in the world. But again, all of this excavation would be in the area where the city would have been when Joshua came and took it over with, with God's power. It's in the same area, right beside the spring today. I mean, still beside the spring, and you see the spring is mentioned here with water there representing that. But here's the site, and this is a tell. Just like, it looks different because we're in the desert now. There's no longer grass and all that. We're in the desert. But this is, part of the excavation that has taken place. And this is actually one of the newest things that has been uncovered in this tell. This is a wall that has been excavated. And to my knowledge has not been rebuilt, that it is there as it was found. And then inside, this where they have dug out this square. I have a better picture I should have used in this slide, but this is the kind of remains of a tower that would have been attached to the wall. Now, even though you go, oh, they found a wall, this must be part of the wall that was destroyed when Joshua. No, this is actually from before, would have been before the time of Joshua. So we're talking 1,500, 1,600 years before Christ, when these items or this wall, this tower would have been built. Now this has been uncovered for quite a while, but this is the remains of a tower that has been dated to 9,500 BC. Now, those of you that are good at math, how old would that make it? 9,500 BC. Yeah, about 12,000 years old. And this is why, now, some of you may not even believe that the earth is that old. Okay, so this is not a commentary on how old the earth is. This is just what archaeologists have dated this tower as 9,500 BC. This is the reason why they claim that it's the oldest city in the world. Okay, because they found this tower from, almost 10,000 years before the time of Jesus. And so that is why they claim to be the oldest city in the world. There is a traditional site beside the city of Jericho. This is known as the Mount of Transfiguration. I said that wrong. Not Transfiguration. Temptation. Mount of Temptation. Sorry, got my T words mixed up. And so this is known as the Mount of Temptation because Jesus went into the wilderness, the Judean wilderness, when he was tempted. And so this is a traditional site. Now, I did not go up there. You can take a cable car and go up there. I did not do that. But how do we know that it's a traditional site? Well, I tricked you because it's not a Catholic church this time. It's a Greek Orthodox monastery that's up on top of this thing. That's what I'm told. I haven't seen it. I don't have a picture of it other than this long distance picture. But this is the traditional site of the temptation of Jesus. I asked Dr. Cloud, who was our leader, who was a longtime professor of Hebrew and Greek and is now a professor of archaeology. I said, what are the chances that this is actually the place? He said about 2%. So take that for what it's worth. But this is a traditional site of the temptation of Jesus. All right, I think I've heard at least one bell. So probably the most significant thing, though, that happened to me at the city of Jericho was that I got to ride a camel with my dad. And the most significant thing was that I actually got my dad up on a camel, which was pretty awesome. So anyway, thanks for hanging with me tonight. I forgot to mention this at the top, but I'm going to be gone next week. But you are going to be in great hands. Bruce Zupa is going to teach next week's class. Bruce has been to Israel 6 times. 6 times. He gave me a smirk. 6 times. And he's a wonderful photographer. So I kind of wish I could be here next week to see what he's going to show. But I'm sure whatever it is, it's going to be great, and you're going to learn a lot from him. I could learn a lot from him. So I appreciate Bruce being willing to step in next week, and then Lord willing, I will be back with you in 2 weeks. Thanks for hanging with me tonight. Let me know if you have any questions. I know I've kept you a little bit over. Let me know if you guys have any questions, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week.